Hello, everybody. Um, I feel lucky, but also a little humbled because I'm listening to other panels, especially Alexa and Claire's, and seeing these beautiful images of newly formed districts. And we're going to talk about the city we have,
Right.
and what we do with it.
Exactly.
And actually, I think that's a really interesting question to ask. Everybody's been asking what happens with office, what happens with retail, what happens in the neighborhoods. So I kind of wanted to start with the neighborhoods. We talk about, Midtown and how it's changing, but the neighborhoods have changed as well. And I think there may be lessons we can learn from our neighborhoods that might actually have an effect on places like Midtown, right? These office districts that were meant for millions of people coming in for work and coming out. And I know you, because we talked, you live in Washington Heights. So wondering if maybe we'll start with the neighborhood and move our way downtown.
Oh, absolutely. And it's great to be up here on stage with you. Have a few really lovely conversations kind of leading up to this. So in some of our earlier conversations, we were talking about up in Washington Heights where I live. And what's really kind of amazing about it is there's along Edgecombe facing towards the Bronx, there's this amazing park system. And being a relatively recent person who moved in there, it's kind of always been like that. But as things happen in New York, you take your kids to the playground, you meet other parents. And I heard these amazing stories about how it used to be the garbage dump. And it was really a group of people in the community who got together and collectively said, okay, we're going to start to clean this up. And then we're going to start to put it together. And then maybe we need a playground. Maybe we can petition for that. We really should. And what was interesting is it was a people of different social and economic backgrounds that got together to do this. And it was all based out of this idea of the common good. Like, what do we all have in common that we really need to make a living here really worth it? And it was that really bottom-up, ground-up thing that I found incredibly compelling. And if you'd not known that it was a community effort, you would just think it was out of the best interest of the city, but they had to make it and fight for it. And it was intriguing to see that the city has the capacity to be able to hear those voices and deliver.
Yeah, but I'm also wondering, right, so our neighborhoods have a mix of housing, a mix of uses, small and sort of mid-scale buildings, rent stabilization as well. And so when we think about sort of our larger office districts, right, that are funded, through hedge funds and private equity, and people have 7 to 10 year leases, are there lessons we can learn from the neighborhood that might be applicable, to the kinds of transformations that we'll need, right, given sort of like what we've seen with the pandemic, with work from home, in places like Midtown and downtown Manhattan?
Well, we've seen some of that in the beginning with how things happened in COVID with the outdoor dining, right? So what was interesting is that those were completely illegal structures, and that people, in order to stay in business, they found a way to stay in business and meet all of the COVID regulations by building these things that weren't compliant. And interestingly, those are becoming legalized in a way, right? So the processes of adapting to ground up community action quickly is being shown to be possible. And what was interesting is that phenomenon happened like all over New York. Like, one would expect to see it in restaurants that have really high rents, right? And they're struggling to get by. So I would expect that in Midtown. But even like up in my neighborhood and other neighborhoods, your corner bodega was doing that. So that was an interesting thing. And how it emerged out of a crisis, and no one would have ever thought that because of a lockdown, someone would have changed how you dine in New York. And the beautiful thing is that's going to be with us, in perpetuity now, moving forward.
Yeah. One of the things, and I agree that in my neighborhood, right, almost overnight, we had all the things, at least as urban planners, we've been fighting for decades, right? Like outdoor dining, more recreation, flexibility in our work schedules. And what was interesting to me was actually the residential neighborhoods became mixed use, right? Became office districts to a certain extent,
right.
Although we haven't acknowledged them. And by the way, that's illegal, right? Our regulations don't right, don't have, you know, the code that says, yes, you can make that an office. Yes, your apartment is now an office. And that, right, that all happened slower. So I think with the pandemic, we saw some things happen quickly, maybe out of the reach of the regulators and the code enforcers, which now is sort of a new normal.
Right. This might end up being, you know, the home office thing might end up being off the books finally, because enforcement would be a nightmare.
Yes. And
you're not in there on a Teams meeting, are you? Hello?
Yes. And so I think that's interesting, and now we're 2.5 years into that situation. But, you know, when you look historically, many of those things, it's a much longer process.
Right.
And especially if we think about New York, right, with a shift, let's say, you know, manufacturing to a service economy, or, you know, container shipping and what that did to the New York harbor, and moving, you know, shipping to New Jersey because of the depth of, you know, the East River, the Hudson. It took decades of decline before then, frankly, you know, quasi-legal uses, whether it be, you know, vending or loft living or other things, you know, came about. And so one of the things that I fear a little bit is, right, especially with office buildings, will we have to go through that same Soho, Tribeca, Williamsburg process of decline for decades before the investors finally give up and allow, or our city agencies give up and allow for different uses?
It is interesting because, as you mentioned before, the Soho example, you know, it's a 30-year kind of bottom out, and then you have artists, you know, who move into there, groups of people, you know, as you were saying, who move in, who probably have never lived in the city before, are finding some way of accommodating, you know, their needs for living and working, and somehow that becomes a type. And what was interesting is like the Soho kind of loft thing, that typology didn't exist. That typology emerged out of the collapse of an industrial base and having just space available, and these artists making something out of it. Yeah. So that's one thing that we were kind of kicking around, is like, I wonder, like typologically, you know, what else can emerge out of these base conditions? But also there's other typologies that had existed prior, right, that may have some legs nowadays. And some examples of those would be...
I mean, I have a million of them, but I mean, the cold water flat, the backyard apartment, the attic. I mean, you know, for me, those were the spaces in many ways problematic, as we've seen with increasing storms, with people in basement apartments, but done correctly, those things are affordable, were traditionally our affordable housing, which were zoned out, right? That we had a competition for micro units because the code doesn't allow for them, right? So I think we've had some experiments, but still on the books, you know, some of the things that are the most affordable are things we can't do, or we can't finance, or code won't allow.
Well, and that's the interesting thing about how those things emerge, because there was a place in time when there was a population that needed really cheap housing, and there was also some kind of business model that was able to feed that housing, to create it and sustain their own business off of it. So sometime all of those things came together and it worked. And as you were pointing out, it's the urban reformers that came in, and there were mixed reasons behind it, but in many ways it was very legitimate things about life safety and having things be, you know, people finding, you know, a fire escape, and every unit needs to have a window. And in essence, that killed a whole host of housing options and typologies that really allowed the city to thrive and allowed folks, you know, of every, you know, background to work their way up through the economic and class ladders to have the potential, right, to get there. But without that kind of missing piece, you have a real stratification in the way the housing is going, and it seems it's only getting further and further apart, and it's the basis of that we're really missing.
Yeah. I mean, Soho is great if you want a pair of Nikes or you want an Armani sweater now. But I wonder if we make that same switch, if our office becomes something else, how we also make it equitable. Because even down, right, it's a pretty great success that many of the 20s and 30s office buildings in lower Manhattan have switched to residential, but they're almost uniformly luxury residential.
Oh, yeah.
So I wonder when we think about converting, how we sort of avoid the, let's say, Sohoization, or the rush towards, right, a luxury enclave, as we do these conversions.
Whatever the next version of 421A, or that is, so the tax incentive program that's set up to create, if a developer wants to build and then over a certain square footage, or even if they want to build but get tax breaks, if you provide a certain amount of affordable housing within that, then you get a tax break. So I think there's levers, like at the city and state level, that could begin to try to make those things happen. I don't know where the legislation is right now. 421A recently went out. I guess for me if you talk about opportunities in a crisis, maybe there's an opportunity from a statutory point of view to reframe that to be more aggressive in terms of trying to get more mixed income opportunities, specifically tied around adaptive reuse of office to residential.
Yeah.
That might be one way.
Yeah.
It's the way that the development community is proven to respond to. So there is positive track record.
There is. You mentioned sort of the loft in Soho, and now one can go to Portland, Oregon, or Bozeman, Montana, and rent a loft.
Right.
Built ground up, which is a strange notion that this typology has now become, right, something that's marketed far away from its origins. And so I wonder, from an AECOM perspective, like, do you imagine what that office building might look like? Does that become a typology that then people start building ground up? Like, is it mixed use? Is it different than what we see now?
Well, buildings have an incredibly long lifespan if they're built correctly. And it seems as though most of the 20th century built square footage has really been driven by a very careful adherence to its first use, to exactly the size of spaces that you need, very tight fit, efficient, all of those things. The real question is in the second and third and fourth life of the building, will that basic fundamental framework allow for the flexibility of new uses to come in and out of it? Yeah. And it was that bit from the RABA in the 70s, they were, after the first couple oil crises, they were looking for buildings. The proclamation was that all buildings moving forward shall be, okay, but long life, low energy, and loose fit. And the last bit, loose fit, is incredibly fascinating, because if you could figure out some way that you come up with a very neutral column spacing that you can test out and prove that it can easily flex from residential to office to light manufacturing to a bodega, like, as a first build thing, right, is a way of trying to set the trajectory in the future in a better way, that'll make a lot of difference. But if there's the planning ahead with what energy and resources we have to make things in the future, but one of the key things about the Soho thing that's really interesting is that's totally driven by the contingencies of the built form that we inherited from the 20th century. And that's where dealing with these issues in the city becomes really interesting and challenging, in that of all the limitations that you have to have, people find workarounds. Right. Like the restaurant you mentioned, the bodega you mentioned the other day, didn't tell me where, don't worry, I won't rat him out. But like in the back of it, there was like
there's a taqueria.
A taqueria, yeah. Like completely non-compliant use, but who's gonna go in there and necessarily check? Right. And that's one thing that makes the city really compelling, is the way that economic pressures, it really heightens the metabolism of how people respond.
Right, and I guess the question, which we can try to answer, is how do we accelerate that, right? Because we have this moment, let's say, 20 to 30% occupancy, which is unsustainable for the current financing and, just the operations and the cost of running these buildings. But I certainly don't want to wait 20 years for them to fall into disrepair for some return. And that's sort of the situation we've seen historically. And so, in thinking about how we accelerate that process, is it a regulatory process? Are we going to need to bail out the office REITs? I think there are a lot of questions there that aren't just about the form of the building, but also how it's financed, how leases are structured.
No, absolutely. And the default is that you let the collapse happen, right? And then you have the kind of long, dark night of something, and then it'll slowly kind of rebuild. Not too distinct from Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogies, right? Right. So what we're trying to do is find a way to take the dark ages of what typical property would have to go through and make it, instead of 30 years, maybe like 10 to get to something new. The good thing is this is not a mystery. The cycles have happened before. You can see it coming. So the real question is, what would be the best place to begin to study that to be able to get ahead of it, right? And there could be academic institutions that take it on, maybe, RPA, city planning.
NYU.
NYU, perhaps? I hear they're crackerjack at this kind of thing.
I think,
So you'll invite me to that studio you run, right?
I will,
Okay.
of course. But I think, for us, that teach real estate, I think it's also, there's always this class, real estate fundamentals, but the fundamentals are shifting. So I think we definitely have to rethink the fundamentals, because we still, I think, in many cases teach, right, like that there's a 30-year mortgage, and that, commercial leases are 7 to 10 years, and we underwrite accordingly, and we figure out the financing. But I think we're going to have to, teach more innovative methods, and probably be more like architecture, to be more speculative. Like, what if this happened? Not what's the current condition and what are the precedents, but like, what would, for example, that 1970s awful window, office building with inoperable windows, right, and a bad ventilation system look like if it did change, right? Because that's going to be the problem. The 20s office building is going to be just fine. Because
those are going to be your high-dollar apartments first and foremost, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be the Class C buildings that are sitting in a developer's portfolio that are, the 1970s, completely sealed on the outside, 3,000 square foot, floor plates. They have like really deep lease span back to the core. So there's all the space around it that you couldn't convert into residential. That's the wicked series of problems.
And have you had commercial tenants approach you yet?
No, but we've done some looking ahead work. We early on were in conversation with Adams' administration, trying to think through how to realize some of his initiatives, and one of those was this idea of converting office into residential. And some of the things that make that easy is the fact that you have typically a taller floor-to-floor height in an office building. So being able to make the mechanical chases and the plumbing chases work, that's kind of an easier lift. The real challenge usually is the depth and the exterior wall, because the exterior walls in these things in no way were meant to be something that you could like open up a window and get some fresh breezes.
Yeah. And so is technology part of that? Can we think about the ways that technology might solve some of the problems in the early 20th century, right? So, right, the dangerous, let's say, old law tenement, right? The solution was a fire escape, a window in every room. Do we have ways of thinking about how we take these spaces that are ideal in terms of location, transportation access, for housing and other uses, but through technology might make them more efficient, might make them more habitable?
No, absolutely. Nothing is immediately coming to mind at the moment. Well, okay, so as you're talking about that in technology, it puts me in mind of the dead zone kind of in the middle of the building, where you kind of run out of apartment that's workable, and because of the light and air requirements, you can't have a bedroom without a window, that kind of thing. Right. So the space in the middle, I mean, what if that was an interior greenhouse that's fed by lights, right? So you have PVs on the roof, that's feeding into, that, and then you have a very tight kind of farm-to-table cycle.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine if on your apartment floor, you could actually do your own composting, right? And so you have a super small, cycle of the nutrients, right? And maybe there's more that you kind of share with folks. It turns into a feeder system for restaurants. I mean, we've looked at taking a lot of we did this really cheeky study looking at some of the super tall high-rises, the pencil towers, and we said, okay, what if this becomes a stranded asset, right? And the city gets it at a fire sale. What do you do with this thing? Because it's actually a waste of energy to tear the thing down. Yeah. So we did several studies about, harvesting light, harvesting wind. How would you, in the confines of the structural system, start to do vertical farms? Started running numbers, based on that. Yeah. So there's a lot of potential for these things. It's just going to really take a different way of thinking about it, and as you were saying, a different approach to how it's financed.
Exactly. Well, I want to see that, but I also want to understand how you get that last person that paid $20 million for their apartment out of the building.
This is the collapse narrative, right? Okay. That happens when their money is, taken out of it.
Got it.
There's not an acceleration story there. Those things are going to die their own death, sadly. We're going to have to wait.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I also see this as a resiliency discussion, right? Like, these are the buildings we have. The most efficient thing we can do, the most sustainable thing we can do is figure out a new life for them.
Right.
Rather than, right, going someplace else, creating a new district or a new typology.
And so much of the city, right, these materials of buildings really aren't all one thing at one time. Interiors turn over every 5 to 10 years. If you do the structure correctly, it should last 300 to 400. But the exterior walls of these things usually have a 50 to 60 year life cycle. So interestingly enough, a heck of a lot of square footage of the city was built right after the war. It's World War II.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of buildings out there that, by virtue of how they're passing through their life cycle, the exterior walls are falling apart. So it's a huge opportunity within the city. And I think that might be the trigger to say, hey, maybe we should make this residential because we got to tear the exterior wall off anyway.
Right.
So those are the kind of weird triggers that take it in a completely different direction.
Yeah. But it sounds like we'll be doing it one building at a time. So we might not see that transformation all at once, but actually that might make for a more interesting, more dynamic city.
You bet it will.
And I guess we're out of time.
I think we're out of time.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Francis and Mark. So we're going to step out for a short break now. I wanted to share a few quick reminders and updates for you. First, over the break, I hope you'll make it a mission to plan dinner with other attendees if you haven't done so already. Second, there are amazing meetups happening tonight. Rima, is Rima in the room? Somewhere? Hopefully you can find Rima if she's around. She's partnered with ReadyMade to host an artist studio tour starting at New York Center for Architecture at 6 p.m. You can find Rima in the lobby or on the app to learn about this more and make plans. If you want to catch any of the virtual sessions over the break, our next online talk is about the future of world cities with a focus on Europe. So go stretch your legs, grab some refreshments, ask about the level of dust in the rooms, materials. See, we're all learning. And we'll see you back here, I believe, at 3:45. Thank you.